Some of you keep this whole place running from the back. That's right. Don't worry, folks. We'll have you back to loading trucks before anyone notices you're gone.
Why is he laughing at my dad? Are you gonna get him back?
I'm trying. Give me some time.
Not back, just even with the truth. Let's talk about the shortcut you approved.
The CEO humiliated a single dad in front of his daughter. His revenge came 6 months later. There's a moment, 6 months from now, when Marcus Wren will sit across a conference table from the man he humiliated in front of a room full of strangers, and realize, too late, that he never once bothered to learn his name. This is the story of what happens in between. It starts on a Tuesday night, the kind of night nobody remembers, in a warehouse where the lights never quite turn off. Daniel Ruiz had worked the night shift at Holden Logistics for 6 years. He knew the building the way some men know their own hands, which aisle flooded when it rained, which forklift pulled left, which supervisor actually listened when something was wrong. He wasn't the loudest man on the floor. He didn't need to be. When something broke at 2 a.m. and there was no one else to call, they called Daniel. He'd raised his daughter Emma almost entirely on his own since his wife passed 4 years ago, and there was a particular kind of tired that came with that, not the tired of hard labor, though there was plenty of that too, but the tired of always being the last line of defense. He didn't complain about it. He just showed up, night after night, packed her lunch before his shift ended, and made sure she never once felt the absence of anything she needed. What Daniel hadn't told anyone, not his coworkers, not his supervisor, not even Emma, was that 8 months earlier, he'd quietly finished a compliance and vendor management certification online, studying in the break room during his lunch 15 minutes at a time. He hadn't told anyone because he didn't want the attention if it didn't work out. He just wanted, someday, to be more than a job title on a badge. That, someday, was about to get complicated. On an ordinary night, you'd have found him at 1:40 a.m. crouched beside Bay 4, flashlight between his teeth, tracing a wiring fault in a forklift charger that had already taken down 2 shifts of productivity before anyone thought to call him. He fixed it in 11 minutes. Nobody wrote that down anywhere. It just became one more thing that got quietly absorbed into the rhythm of the building, the way water gets absorbed into ground that's used to it. You ever think about moving up? His coworker Ruben had asked him once, watching him close the panel back up. Office job. Better hours. Thought about it, Daniel had said, and left it there, the way he left most things, half said, folded up small enough to carry without it weighing on anybody but him. The company's annual anniversary dinner was the one night a year when the warehouse floor and the executive suite were supposed to share the same room. Daniel almost didn't go. But Emma had asked to come. She loved dressing up, loved seeing her dad in something other than a company polo, and he didn't have it in him to say no to her. They sat near the front. He hadn't chosen the seat. Somebody with a clipboard had. And that's where the story really begins. Marcus Wren had built Holden Logistics from a single regional trucking contract into a company that now moved freight for half the retailers in the Midwest. He was good at exactly one thing, and he knew it, making a room believe he was in control of everything in it. Charm, timing, a sense for the camera even when there wasn't one. What he wasn't good at, what he'd never had to be good at, was remembering that the company ran on people whose names he'd never learned. Emma had picked out her dress herself, a deep green one with a little gold ribbon at the waist, and she'd spun once in the hotel lobby just to feel it move. Daniel had watched her do it and felt, for a second, like maybe the tired was worth it after all. They found their table, name cards printed in careful script, and Emma traced the letters of her own name with one finger like it was something precious. Wren took the stage a little after 8, backlit, a glass of something amber in his hand, working the room the way he always did, a joke about quarterly numbers, a toast to the people who make this company what it is, applause that came easy because it always did. Daniel clapped along like everyone else. Emma clapped too, mimicking the adults around her, proud just to be included. Halfway through his remarks that night, gesturing loosely toward the tables near the stage, he made a joke about keeping the lights on down in the warehouse, and then, without meaning to single out anyone specific, his eyes landed on Daniel's name tag.
Don't worry, folks, we'll have you back to loading trucks before anyone notices you're gone.
Daniel kept his eyes on the road for a long moment. Because there's a right time to say something, he said finally, and a wrong time. That wasn't the right time. When's the right time? He didn't have an answer for her that night. He wasn't sure he had one for himself. That night, after he'd tucked her in, he stood in the doorway of her room longer than he needed to, listening to her breathing even out. She'd hung her green dress carefully on the closet door instead of leaving it in a heap on the floor, like she wanted to remember it looked nice even though the night hadn't stayed nice. That detail undid him more than the joke itself had. He went back downstairs, poured a glass of water he didn't drink, and sat at the kitchen table in the dark for a while, turning something over in his mind that he wasn't ready to name yet. What he did have, sitting in a folder in his desk drawer at home, was a printed certificate from a compliance program he'd finished in March. He'd been telling himself he'd apply for something internal when the timing was right. He'd been telling himself that for months. 2 days after the dinner, an internal posting went up, compliance analyst, contracts and vendor oversight. Daniel read it 3 times before he let himself believe it was real. It wasn't a stretch, it was, if anything, exactly the role his certification had prepared him for. But applying meant admitting, out loud, that he wanted more than the floor. It meant risking a no that would confirm what that joke in the ballroom had implied about him. He applied anyway. Not out of spite. Out of something quieter and more stubborn than that, the simple refusal to let one man's careless joke be the last word on what he was capable of. The interview was with Priya Anand, VP of Operations, a woman with a reputation for reading people accurately and a low tolerance for wasted time. She'd pulled his file, 6 years, 0 disciplinary marks, 3 commendations from shift supervisors for catching inventory discrepancies before they became real problems, and she'd noticed something else, something most people in the building had walked past without seeing. "You've been doing compliance work informally for years," she told him, tapping his file. "You just never had the title for it." "I noticed things," Daniel said. "Didn't seem like my place to make it official." "It's your place now, if you want it," she said. "I'll be honest with you, this is a visible role. It touches our biggest contracts. People will ask why a warehouse lead is sitting in these meetings." Daniel thought about Emma's face in that ballroom. "Let them ask," he said. Priya leaned back in her chair, studying him the way she studied contracts, for what was actually there, not what was implied. "Can I ask you something off the record?" "Sure." "Why now? You finished that certification back in March. You could have applied then." Daniel considered lying, or at least softening it. He didn't. "Something happened at the anniversary dinner. Made me stop waiting for the right time and just pick a time." Priya didn't ask what. Something in her expression told him she already had a decent guess, and that she respected him more for not turning it into a complaint. "Then I'm glad it did," she said, and closed his file. He got the offer 2 weeks later. The transition wasn't glamorous. Nobody threw him a party. A few of his old co-workers on the floor congratulated him with the kind of warmth that meant it, and a few gave him the tight, polite nod that meant something else entirely, the specific discomfort some people feel when someone they'd quietly filed away as just the warehouse guy turns out to have been underestimated the whole time. Daniel didn't let it touch him. He showed up early, stayed late, and did what he'd always done, paid attention to details other people skipped past. Within his first month, he'd flagged 2 minor vendor discrepancies that saved the company real money. Within 2, Priya had started routing him the contracts nobody else wanted to untangle, because he untangled them without complaint and without cutting corners. At home, Emma noticed the change before he said much about it. He came home less exhausted. He talked about spreadsheets instead of forklifts. One night over dinner, she asked, "Do you like it? The new job?" "I like being trusted with something that matters," he said. "That's different from liking the job itself. But yeah. I like it." She smiled at that in a way that made the whole 6 months feel worth it already. There were harder days too, ones he didn't bring home. A senior analyst named Hollis made a habit of double-checking Daniel's work long after it had proven itself reliable, the kind of quiet scrutiny that never quite crossed into anything he could name as unfair. Daniel let the work answer for him. By month 3, Hollis had stopped checking. He never said why. He didn't have to. Daniel kept the printed certificate from his desk drawer at home pinned above his new desk at the office, not as a trophy, but as a reminder of the 15-minute lunches that had gotten him there before anyone in that ballroom ever thought to look twice at him. Here's where it gets complicated. 6 months after that dinner, Daniel was handed a routine compliance review, a scheduled audit of vendor performance across the company's top-tier contracts. It was tedious work, cross-referencing shipment logs against signed agreements, the kind of task most people in the department quietly dreaded. Daniel didn't mind it. Tedious work was where he found things other people missed. 3 days in, he found something. Holden's largest single contract, a multi-year freight agreement with a national retail client, the deal Marcus Wren referenced constantly in earnings calls as proof the company had arrived, had a compliance gap buried in its fulfillment terms. Somewhere in the rush to close the deal a year earlier, a shortcut had been taken on delivery verification standards, one that technically violated the terms Holden had promised its client in writing. It hadn't caused a problem yet. But it was sitting there, a liability with a fuse on it, waiting for the client's own audit team to find it first, which, given the size of the account, they eventually would. Daniel sat with the file a long time before he said anything to anyone. He didn't yet know what he was looking at. Contracts of that size ran through executive approval. Whoever had signed off on the shortcut had done so at a level well above his own. He wasn't naive about what that meant. He ran the numbers twice more that week, half hoping he was wrong, because being wrong would have been simpler. He wasn't wrong. The delivery verification standard promised in writing to the client didn't match what Holden had actually been doing for the better part of a year, and the gap between the two wasn't an accident. Somewhere, a decision had been made to move faster than the contract allowed, and nobody had circled back to fix it once the deal was signed and the applause had died down. He printed the relevant pages and laid them out across his kitchen table that Friday night, the same table where Emma did her homework, and stared at them the way he used to stare at a wiring fault at 2 in the morning, waiting for the pattern to show itself. It was Emma, of all people, who connected the last piece. She'd been helping him organize his home office one Saturday, a habit they'd fallen into since the promotion, her sorting old papers into a recycling pile while he worked at his desk. In a drawer, she found the folded event agenda from that dinner 6 months earlier. She'd kept it without telling him why, tucked into her backpack for weeks afterward and eventually forgotten in the move to a new folder. She didn't fully understand, at 10, why she'd kept it. She just hadn't wanted to let it go. "Dad," she said, unfolding it, "isn't this the guy from the paper you're working on? The contract one?" Daniel looked up. She was pointing at the printed program from the anniversary dinner, Marcus Wren's name and title, listed as the executive sponsor of record for the very client account Daniel had spent the week auditing. He hadn't made the connection himself. He'd been so focused on the numbers that he hadn't looked at who'd signed the original approval that created the shortcut in the first place. He looked now. It was Wren's signature on the internal memo authorizing the accelerated fulfillment terms, the decision that, over a year later, had quietly created the exact liability Daniel was now responsible for reporting. "Are you going to get him back?" Emma asked. Not gleeful. Genuinely uncertain, watching her father's face for the answer. It was a fair question. Daniel sat with it longer than he expected to. Some part of him, the part that had sat frozen in that ballroom chair while his daughter's ears went red, wanted the answer to be yes, wanted it badly enough that he could feel the shape of it forming before he caught himself. It would have been easy. A word in the wrong meeting, a report worded just sharp enough to draw blood. Nobody would have questioned it. The findings were real either way. But he kept coming back to the same image, Emma at 10, asking him a question like that with a hopeful, uncertain look on her face, waiting to learn from him what fairness was supposed to look like when someone finally had the power to enforce it. He thought about the ballroom. He thought about her ears going red. He thought about every version of this moment he'd allowed himself to imagine in the months since, the version where he walked into Ren's office and said something the man would never forget. Then he thought about what kind of man he actually wanted his daughter to watch him become. "No," he said finally. "I'm going to do my job. That's not the same thing as getting him back. But it might feel like it, in the end, just not because I made it about him." Emma studied him for a second, the way she did when she was deciding whether an answer was actually true or just something adults said. Then she nodded, satisfied, and went back to sorting papers. The finding went up the chain the way findings were supposed to, through Priya first, then, because of the size of the account, straight to the executive review board. Priya read the report twice before she looked up at Daniel across her desk. "You know whose signature is on the original approval," she said. It wasn't a question. "I know. You could have buried this. Called it a gray area. Nobody would have blamed you." "I could have," Daniel agreed. "But then it's not gray anymore, it's the reason our biggest client walks away in 2 years when their own team finds it before we fix it. I didn't take this job to protect anybody's feelings. I took it because I'm good at seeing what other people miss." Priya looked at him for a long moment, something that might have been respect settling into her expression. "Then you're presenting it yourself," she said. "Boardroom. Thursday. Ren will be there." Thursday arrived with the kind of quiet dread that settles over a building before a meeting everyone's already heard about. Daniel had prepared the way he prepared for everything, thoroughly, without drama, laying out the documentation in the order that made the story tell itself. He wasn't planning a confrontation. He was planning a presentation. There was a difference, and he intended to keep it that way. Marcus Wren walked into the boardroom already talking, the way he always did, filling the space before anyone else could claim it. He didn't recognize Daniel at first, why would he, until Priya introduced him as the compliance analyst who'd flagged the issue on the retail account. Something flickered across Wren's face. Recognition, arriving a beat too slow. The warehouse. The dinner. Daniel watched him place it and said nothing, let the silence do what silence does. "Go ahead," Priya said. Daniel laid it out cleanly. No editorializing, no reference to the dinner, no mention of anything that had happened between them personally. Just the shipment logs. The signed terms. The point, 11 months back, where they diverged. The memo authorizing the shortcut, time-stamped and signed. The exposure it created. The window that was closing before the client's own audit found it independently, a window that, if used correctly, still gave Halden time to fix it quietly and preserve the relationship. The room was very still. Wren's jaw had tightened somewhere around the 4th slide, his hand drifting to the signet ring on his finger, turning it once, twice, the same nervous habit that showed up whenever the room stopped being about him and started being about the truth. 2 board members exchanged a glance across the table, the kind that said they'd wondered about this account before and never had the nerve, or the standing, to ask. "This memo," Wren said finally, his voice careful in a way it hadn't been in months, was a judgment call to close the deal on time. "I don't recall it being framed as a violation." "It wasn't framed as anything," Daniel said, even, unhurried. "It was signed. That's all a compliance file needs to know." Nobody laughed this time. Nobody needed to fill the silence for him. Priya spoke into it instead. "The findings are accurate. We have two options, self-report and remediate now, on our terms, or wait for their audit team to find it and lose the account entirely. I know which one I'm recommending. Ren looked at Daniel for a long moment, really looked, the way he should have looked 6 months ago in that ballroom, at a man whose name he hadn't bothered to learn. You could have made this harder for me, Ren said, quieter than before, almost to himself. I could have, Daniel said. But I didn't build my career on making things harder for people. I don't plan to start now. He let that sit for exactly as long as it needed to, then added the only line in the whole meeting that touched what had happened between them personally, not an accusation, just a fact laid down and left there. For what it's worth, I was at the dinner in March. Front row. My daughter was with me. He didn't say anything else about it. He didn't need to. He gathered his folder, thanked the board for their time, and left the room before anyone had to decide how to respond. The company self-reported the discrepancy within the week, on Daniel's recommended terms, and the relationship with the client survived, barely, and only because it had been caught early by someone who cared enough to do the job right instead of quietly looking away. Word moved through Holden the way word does in any building that size, not as gossip, exactly, but as a kind of quiet, collective recalibration. The man from the warehouse had found what 6 months of executive oversight had missed, and he'd handled it without making a spectacle of the man who'd once made a spectacle of him. Ren never gave a public apology. Men like him rarely do, not in the clean, satisfying way stories sometimes promise. But 2 weeks later, in an all-staff email about the client renewal, he included a line crediting the diligence of our compliance team, particularly Daniel Ruiz, by name, the first time in 6 years that Marcus Wren had learned it, let alone said it out loud where people could hear. It wasn't an apology. But it was the truth, finally spoken instead of joked away, and for Daniel, that was enough. Around the warehouse, the story traveled the way these things do, gaining small details it didn't need, that he'd walked into the boardroom and laid the folder down without a word, that Wren had gone pale, that somebody had heard the CEO apologize outright. None of that was quite true, and Daniel never bothered correcting any of it. What mattered to him wasn't the version people told each other over lunch. It was the version that had actually happened, the one only he, Priya, and a handful of board members had really seen, quiet, factual, and over before anyone had the chance to make it into a spectacle. Priya stopped by his desk a few days later, setting down a cup of coffee she didn't need to bring. For what it's worth, she said, that's the most controlled I've ever seen anyone handle a room like that. Wasn't trying to control it, Daniel said. Just trying to be right. Same thing, most days, she said, and left it there. That night, at the kitchen table, Emma sat across from her father, doing homework while he read through the last of the follow-up paperwork on his laptop. Did he say sorry? She asked, not looking up from her worksheet. No, Daniel said. But he said my name right, in front of the whole company. That's about as close as some people get. Emma considered this with the particular seriousness only a 10-year-old can bring to a kitchen table conversation. I wasn't embarrassed of you that night, she said finally. At the dinner. I want you to know that. I was embarrassed for you. That's different. Daniel looked at his daughter for a long moment, and something in his chest loosened that had been tight for 6 months without him fully realizing it. I know the difference, he said. Believe me. I've thought about it every day since. She went back to her homework. He went back to his laptop. And the kitchen settled into the kind of ordinary quiet that only exists in a house where something has finally been set right. Later, after she'd gone up to bed, Daniel stood in her doorway again, the way he had 6 months earlier, except this time there was nothing heavy sitting in his chest, just the quiet satisfaction of a thing finally squared away. He thought about the green dress still hanging carefully in her closet, about the folded agenda she'd kept without knowing why, about all the small, patient ways a 10-year-old had helped carry him to a moment he couldn't have reached on his own. Some men wait their whole lives for a room to see them clearly. Daniel Ruiz got his chance because he refused to let one bad night decide what the rest of his story would say about him, and because his daughter never once stopped believing there was more to him than a joke on a stage could capture. What Daniel Ruiz proved, without ever raising his voice, is that dignity was never something Marcus Wren had the power to take from him in the first place. It was only ever something he had the power to reveal, later, on his own terms, in a room where the truth did the talking instead of him. So here's the question worth sitting with: when someone underestimates you, is the best response to prove them wrong loudly, or to simply become undeniable, and let them find that out on their own? Thank you for spending this time with Daniel and Emma's story. If it moved you, consider subscribing and sharing your own answer to that question in the comments below. What's the best comeback you've ever witnessed? And if this one stayed with you, there are more stories like it coming soon.